Behind the thunderous speeches and military parades of the Third Reich, there was a man consumed by an ideology of such venomous purity. It became a lethal obsession, a single, fatal idea that would drive him to gamble the fate of humanity for a new world order built on blood. For Adolf Hitler, that obsession was the conquest of the East, the vast lands of Russia and Ukraine, imagined as Germany's living space. It was here, on the boundless steppes, that he saw both his destiny and his enemies. Here, he believed, the Slavs would be enslaved, the Jews eradicated, and the soil of Europe's future empire soaked in blood and grain. At the height of his power, in 1941, Hitler stood on the brink of realizing this vision. His armies had crushed Poland, humbled France, and swept across the continent with terrifying speed. To many, the Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. But what began as a campaign of lightning conquest would soon spiral into a war of annihilation. A struggle so vast, so brutal, it would consume millions of lives and ultimately destroy the empire Hitler sought to build. This is the story of how a dictator's fatal obsession with Russia led not only to his downfall, but to the near destruction of the world itself.
To understand why Hitler launched his armies eastward, we must return to the roots of his obsession. Long before he wore the swastika on his sleeve, he carried in his mind a vision of empire, one carved not in stone, but in soil. The soil of Eastern Europe, stretching from the plains of Ukraine to the depths of Russia, was to be Germany's destiny. This was the concept of Lebensraum, living space, the belief that only by conquering and colonizing the East could Germany secure its future. In Hitler's worldview, this was not conquest for profit. It was conquest for survival, wrapped in racial hatred. He saw the Slavic peoples as untermenschen, subhuman, their cultures destined for destruction. He painted the Jews as the masterminds of Bolshevism, a so-called parasite that had taken root in Moscow. In his fevered imagination, the struggle against the Soviet Union was nothing less than a holy war. A crusade to cleanse Europe of what he called Jewish Bolshevism, and to reshape the continent by fire. This racial war was not a secret plan whispered in shadowy rooms. It was written openly in the pages of Mein Kampf, spoken in rallies, taught to Hitler's followers. And as the Reich expanded, these ideas hardened into policy. Bureaucrats in Berlin drew up chilling blueprints for a new order. The most infamous of them all was the Hunger Plan, a deliberate scheme to starve more than 30 million Soviet men, women, and children so that German settlers could feast on the breadbasket of Ukraine. Death by famine was not an accident of war. It was a goal. Yet beneath this ideological hatred lay a dangerous illusion. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was a brittle colossus, ready to crumble if its head were cut off. He imagined that Stalin's regime, held together by terror, would collapse at the first blow. He believed the Red Army would disintegrate, that the people of the Soviet Union would welcome German troops as liberators. In this fatal miscalculation lay the seeds of catastrophe, not only for Hitler's Reich, but for tens of millions caught in the storm to come. August 23, 1939. In the gilded halls of the Kremlin, German and Soviet officials sat down to sign what seemed unthinkable, a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. The world watched in disbelief. Just months earlier, Nazi propaganda had railed against Bolshevism as a mortal enemy of civilization. Soviet newspapers had denounced fascism as a disease. Yet, here were the two dictators, sworn enemies by ideology, toasting each other with crystal glasses. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was more than a handshake of convenience. Hidden within its secret protocols was a blueprint for the partition of Eastern Europe. Poland would be carved in half like a slaughtered animal. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were quietly assigned to Soviet control. Finland and Romania dangled in the balance. Hitler gained the assurance that his eastern flank would remain silent when he turned west. Stalin, wary of the West's reluctance to face Germany, gained time and territory. For nearly 2 years, this strange alliance held. Soviet trains, loaded with oil, grain, and raw materials, rolled westward into the Reich. German engineers provided Stalin with technology and military equipment. To the outside world, the sight was grotesque: two dictators, who despised everything the other stood for, bound together in cynical cooperation. But beneath the outward smiles, mistrust simmered. Both men knew this pact was a marriage of convenience, destined for betrayal. September 1939 proved its deadly effectiveness. As German tanks smashed into western Poland, Stalin's armies invaded from the east. In weeks, Poland, a nation that had resisted partition for over a century, was once again erased from the map. The pact had delivered. Hitler could now turn his gaze to the west. In 1940, France fell in just 6 weeks. Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all collapsed under the thunder of Blitzkrieg. By the summer of 1941, Hitler was master of continental Europe. Only Britain stood defiant, clinging to survival across the Channel. And yet, even in his hour of triumph, Hitler's thoughts turned not to London, but to Moscow. To him, Britain was a distraction. America, a distant threat. The true battle, the war that would define the future of mankind, lay in the east. And so, even as Soviet oil fueled his tanks and Soviet grain filled German bellies, Hitler prepared to strike the very ally keeping his empire alive. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had bought him time. And time, in Hitler's mind, was running out. On the night of June 21, 1941, the German High Command unleashed its greatest gamble. Along a front stretching more than 1,000 miles, 3 million men stood ready. 19 panzer divisions, over 3,000 tanks, more than 2,000 aircraft, the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. Its name was Operation Barbarossa. Its aim was nothing less than the destruction of the Soviet Union. At 3:15 in the morning, the silence broke. Artillery roared like thunder rolling across the plains. Dive bombers screamed down from the sky. Within hours, Soviet airfields were reduced to burning wreckage. In the first week alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed more than 4,000 Soviet planes, most of them on the ground. Entire armies were engulfed in encirclements, vast pockets of men surrounded by German tanks and cut to pieces with merciless efficiency. Tens of thousands surrendered at a time, marching eastward into captivity, where barbed wire and starvation awaited them. For Stalin, the blow was a nightmare he had refused to believe possible. Despite repeated warnings from his own intelligence services, from British codebreakers, even from his own spies in Tokyo, he had convinced himself that Hitler would not dare attack while still at war with Britain. When the assault came, he was paralyzed, retreating into silence at his dacha outside Moscow. In those first crucial days, the Soviet Union seemed leaderless, teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, the collapse did not come. Ordinary soldiers, caught in the maelstrom, fought with desperate courage. Civilians tore up railways, scorched fields, and burned their own homes to deny the invader shelter. In Belarus, in Ukraine, in Russia itself, the Germans expected a people ready to welcome them as liberators. Instead, they encountered a nation that, however battered, refused to yield. Still, the cost was staggering. By December 1941, more than 4 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire regions lay in ruins. Hitler's dream of a lightning victory seemed within his grasp. The road to Moscow was open. But what Hitler could not see, what his obsession blinded him to, was that the very vastness of Russia, the sheer resilience of its people, and the brutal realities of the land itself, were about to turn his triumph into disaster. By October 1941, the road to Moscow lay before the German armies. Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final strike he believed would bring the Soviet Union crashing down. 3 massive pincers of tanks and infantry drove toward the capital, encircling Red Army divisions in wave after wave of annihilation. Whole Soviet armies vanished. In the fields around Vyazma and Bryansk, nearly 700,000 men were surrounded. German officers boasted that the war was all but won. As the Wehrmacht drew within sight of Moscow's spires, panic rippled through the Soviet capital. Civilians dug trenches with their bare hands. Government offices burned their archives, preparing to evacuate east. Rumors whispered that Stalin himself had fled. But then, in a moment that would define the Soviet war, Stalin refused to leave. On November 7th, as German artillery thundered in the distance, he stood on the reviewing stand in Red Square. Tanks rumbled past him, soldiers marched in formation, not to a parade ground, but directly to the front. To a people who feared their leader's silence, this defiance became a rallying cry: Moscow would not fall. But the Germans pressed on, closer than ever. By late November, they reached the outskirts of the city. Soldiers could see the faint glow of the Kremlin at night. German commanders believed victory was within their grasp. Then, nature itself turned against them. The Russian winter, the coldest in decades, descended like a hammer. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Oil froze solid inside engines. Lubricants turned to ice. Weapons jammed. Tanks, immovable in the snow, became frozen monuments to Hitler's arrogance. The soldiers suffered terribly. Many had no winter clothing, their commanders having assured them the campaign would be over before the frost. Men wrapped themselves in newspapers and straw, their breath freezing in their throats. Horses died by the tens of thousands. Entire divisions became immobilized, victims not of Soviet bullets but of frostbite and hunger. Diaries recovered from the front speak of men weeping in silence, their hands too numb to hold a rifle. And just as the Germans faltered, Siberian divisions, hardened by winters even harsher, arrived to reinforce Moscow. With fresh troops, skis strapped to their boots, and white camouflage cloaks, they counterattacked. On December 5th, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. German soldiers, exhausted and frozen, staggered backward. For the first time in the war, Hitler's blitzkrieg had been stopped. The myth of invincibility was broken. What Hitler promised as a short, decisive campaign had instead become a brutal war of attrition. Moscow was not Paris. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. And now, Hitler's dream of empire in the East was bleeding into the snow. The failure before Moscow did not break Hitler's obsession. If anything, it deepened it. In the summer of 1942, he launched a new campaign, Operation Case Blue. This time, the target was the oil fields of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of his war machine. But along the way lay a city on the Volga, Stalingrad. A city of factories and workers, not of great military value. But for Hitler, the name was everything. Stalin's city had to be erased. For Stalin, the defense of that city became a matter of honor. And so, a battle began that would decide the fate of the war. Stalingrad was unlike any battlefield in history. Bombers reduced entire districts to rubble. Yet that rubble became a fortress. Every street, every factory, every shattered apartment block was contested. German soldiers called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Snipers haunted the ruins. Grenades and knives decided fights in stairwells and sewers. Soldiers fought for single rooms, for single walls. In the tractor factory, men fought until the floors were slick with oil and blood. For months, the German Sixth Army pushed forward, street by street, convinced victory was at hand. But then, in November 1942, the Red Army struck back. Operation Uranus, a counteroffensive planned in secrecy, did not strike the city itself, but the weaker flanks held by Germany's Romanian and Italian allies. Within days, the trap closed. The Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was encircled. Inside the frozen cauldron, the soldiers waited for relief that never came. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground, to fight to the last bullet. He promised air supply, but the Luftwaffe could not deliver. Starvation set in. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Diaries speak of soldiers boiling leather belts to make soup. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Desperation drove men to madness. As the weeks dragged on, General Friedrich Paulus pleaded for permission to break out. Hitler refused. No surrender. No retreat. On January 31, 1943, Paulus finally capitulated. 90,000 emaciated survivors stumbled into captivity. Few would ever return. Nearly 500,000 men had been lost in the campaign. For Germany, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the turning point, a psychological and military catastrophe. The myth of German invincibility lay buried in the ruins of a city that bore Stalin's name. Across the Reich, the news fell like a hammer. For the first time, the German people were told of a disaster too great to conceal. And for Hitler, Stalingrad was more than a lost battle. It was the shattering of his dream. Proof that his war of annihilation in the East would not end in triumph, but in ruin. In the summer of 1943, Hitler sought redemption. The disaster at Stalingrad had shaken Germany to its core, but the Führer still believed one decisive blow could turn the tide. His eyes fixed on a bulge in the front line near the city of Kursk. Here, the Red Army held a salient that jutted westward into German lines. Hitler believed if he crushed it, he could regain the initiative, restore morale, and once again seize the momentum of war. What followed was Operation Citadel, Hitler's last great gamble. It would be the largest tank battle in human history. Thousands of armored giants, Tigers, Panthers, and T-34s, massed on the plains. Artillery lined the horizon. Aircraft crowded the skies. For weeks, German generals urged delay, insisting new weapons must arrive, more tanks must be ready. But every delay gave the Soviets time. Time to dig. Time to mine. Time to prepare defenses in staggering depth. When the offensive finally came in July 1943, the Wehrmacht drove forward with ferocity. Tanks rolled across fields thick with explosives, minefields detonating beneath their treads. Anti-tank guns spat fire from every ridge. In Prokhorovka, one of the largest armored clashes ever fought erupted, steel against steel, point-blank range, tanks ramming each other in clouds of dust and smoke. The fields were left littered with burning hulks. But this was no longer the blitzkrieg of 1940. The Soviet defenses held. Their counterattacks grew stronger each day. The Red Army, supplied by the factories east of the Urals and bolstered by American aid arriving through the Arctic convoys, matched German strength with sheer weight of men and machines. After weeks of slaughter, Hitler called off the offensive. Kursk was lost. The last great German gamble in the East had failed. From that moment on, the initiative belonged to the Soviet Union. The Red Army advanced westward relentlessly, liberating city after city. German divisions, once feared across Europe, now fought only to slow the tide. For Hitler, Kursk marked the death of Blitzkrieg, and the beginning of the long, grinding retreat toward Berlin. By 1945, the thousand-year Reich was crumbling in dust and fire. The Red Army had surged westward, retaking the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk, liberating Kiev, Warsaw, and Budapest. From the east, Stalin's forces pushed relentlessly. From the west, Anglo-American armies crossed the Rhine. Germany, once the conqueror of Europe, was now a besieged fortress. In Berlin, Hitler clung to delusion. His maps showed phantom divisions, entire armies that no longer existed. He barked orders to generals who dared not contradict him. His obsession with the East remained to the bitter end. He demanded his men fight to the last, even as entire cities were ground to rubble. To him, surrender was treason, survival a weakness. April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final assault. Over 1 million men, 20,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of tanks converged on the German capital. The bombardment shook the earth, the thunder of guns turning night into day. Berlin became a battlefield of rubble and ruin. Street by street, house by house, German defenders fought with despairing fury. Boys of the Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfausts, ambushed Soviet tanks in alleyways. Old men of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, died in doorways, defending a city already lost. Beneath the streets, in the Führerbunker, Hitler raged against betrayal. He condemned his generals, cursed his allies, and spoke of final victory even as Soviet shells shook the walls above him. On April 30, 1945, with the Red Army closing in on the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler ended his life with a pistol shot. Eva Braun, his companion, followed him in death. The man who had once dreamed of an empire stretching to the Urals was gone, leaving behind only ruins and ash. On May 2, the Red Army captured Berlin. The swastika was torn down, replaced by the red flag over the Reichstag. Days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the East alone, over 27 million Soviets had perished. Entire cities lay in ruins. Families had been erased from the earth. The war Hitler had unleashed in pursuit of his fatal obsession had consumed his nation, and himself. The war in the East was more than a clash of armies. It was a war of annihilation, born of ideology as much as strategy. Behind the front lines, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, swept across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, executing Jews, Roma, and political prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. Entire villages were erased in fire. This was not collateral damage. It was part of Hitler's vision. A continent cleansed of what he called racial inferiors, rebuilt on the bones of the dead. The Holocaust itself was inseparable from the war in the East. The machinery of extermination, the ghettos, the gas chambers, the death marches, expanded in lockstep with the invasion. In Hitler's obsession, conquest and genocide were threads of the same cloth. The East was to be Germany's future, and millions had to vanish to make room for it. Yet, in the end, this very obsession became Hitler's undoing. By dragging Germany into a war it could not win, against a land too vast, a people too resilient, and an enemy too determined, he sealed his own fate. Blitzkrieg, once unstoppable, drowned in the snows of Moscow, in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the fields of Kursk. The dictator who sought to master the world instead led his nation to ruin. But the story did not end in 1945. From the ashes of Berlin rose a new world divided. The Soviet Union, forged in unimaginable sacrifice, emerged as a superpower. The United States, victorious in the West, stood opposite. Between them stretched an iron curtain, casting Europe into decades of tension, fear, and rivalry. The Cold War was the child of Barbarossa, the shadow of Hitler's failed conquest stretching far beyond his grave. So what are we to make of this history? Did good triumph in 1945, or was it merely the victory of the lesser of two evils? Perhaps the answer lies not in absolutes, but in remembrance. For behind the thunder of armies and the ambitions of tyrants were ordinary people, soldiers freezing in trenches, families torn apart, children starving in bombed-out cities. Their voices remind us that war is never abstract. It is lived in blood, in hunger, in silence. Hitler's fatal obsession did not simply doom his empire. It nearly ended the world. And as we look back across the ruins of the 20th century, we are left with a warning that when hatred becomes policy, and ideology blinds judgment, history itself can teeter on the edge of annihilation.